I want to thank the Seaside Institute for having me here and congratulate my very dear friends, Marieanne and Erik, on the award. Well deserved. So, this talk follows a recent book I wrote. It's been, I guess, a couple of years now, called The Art of the Architect, and it's primarily about these two things. Today we have the easy button in our hand. We can take thousands of images at an instant. We go back to our offices and they go on the server. We can send emails, call people, do math, anything we want to on this simple device. But the idea is, what's the importance of the tools that we use as architects that are essential to who we are as architects in our creative process. This picture that's up there now is a craftsman in Maine. He wakes up every morning to work with his hands, his heart, and his mind. It's with this view of the world that he can connect on a human-to-human level. If we can do that, then we can treasure his work. It will mean something to us, and in turn will embody his spirit, and his life will have meaning. So with this book is not only about drawing, but how we see the world as architects, and how we take information and conjure a thing in our head. Almost an alchemy, taking an idea to physical form, that most directed cognitive path from the mind to the pencil. And how today we have moved from a world of representation to a world of simulation. What are we missing? So this is a house that we're doing out west. It's not our rendering. Actually, we had met with our client. We'd given him the drawings and we'd given him the model. And 2 days later, he sends us back this AI rendering that he had done. So, we can't ignore this. This is the world we're living in today. And in fact, he probably sent another 75 or 80 AI images after this. This is my living room as if Victoria Hagan designed it. My living room as if Alexa Hampton had designed it. On and on and on. So, AI is here to stay, just as the computer is here to stay. Well, I just wanted to say, I'm not afraid of AI. And in fact, I thought, what if I could conjure Michael Imber as a writer, as an architect, as an artist, in his studio in Maine. And so, this is what it came. It's almost right, but there's a gap between what we see in our head and what the machine gives us. So, I grew up in West Texas, and there's an Indian legend of the great creator who, after the creation of this beautiful world, threw all his rubbish in a huge pile in the far reaches of West Texas. This is a huge painting. This painting is something like 16 feet high and 32 feet long. And it sits in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Fort Worth. But as a painting of West Texas, it reaches deep into my sensory memories of what West Texas was as a boy. The smell of ozone and the sage, the distant crack of thunder, not just a mere snapshot, but a cognitive impression of the spirit of a place. The buildings that remain in this landscape still embody our history. It became who I am as a Texan, and it became a part of me as an individual. Remote places where architecture and landscape came together. Not only about our history, but cultural memory, deeply rooted in our stories, our lore, and in our mythology. how our buildings were built from the land and were of the land. As a young man, it was this idea of Texas that made me fall in love with architecture. So what does it mean for me to draw? In 2022, I was the Robert A. M. Stern Visiting Professor of Classical Architecture at Yale. And I had to teach a graduate design course. And we called that graduate design course The Land Between Borders, to design a new institute of Texan cultures. And so this idea of a land between borders was this slice of Texas that was neither Texas nor Mexico at one time. And in order to gain the knowledge to be able to design this institute, the students had to come to Texas. And so we would travel 1,400 miles through Texas, through that zone. It was full of these incredible landscapes and diverse cultures. We'd go from the mouth of the Rio Grande near the coast and places like Roma, Texas, to the hill country, to Marfa and beyond El Paso, exploring the many landscapes and cultural influences of Texas architecture. I handed each student a sketchbook when they got off the bus at the airport and said, you'd fill this to use back in the studio back at Yale. And of course, Yale's a lot like any other architectural program today. They don't require drawing. So I'd give them a sketchbook to fill, to experience, to observe, and to draw, and to see, and to begin to understand the relationship of man and his buildings to the landscape in which we live. We drew to understand place and material, and to understand the twisted tree and how that tree becomes a lintel, and how that lintel informs the character of the building. Many of these students have drawn buildings before. None had ever drawn a tree or a landscape. So every place we went, we brought these sketchbooks and filled them with this knowledge and understanding of place. And we brought those sketchbooks back to the studio at Yale and to the architectural solutions that spoke to culture and place. So my love of drawing came from my childhood. I had this Aunt Margaret, who, as a child, she lived at the end of Old Galveston Highway, where the bridge had been blown out by a hurricane. And so there was just this old oyster shell road that led from her backyard into the swamp. And she would take us as kids with her Dalmatian dog and walk us down this road and point out, all of the bird nests and the trees and the orchids hanging from the trees and the alligator nest and all of this beauty in the swamp that, unless you were an artist, you would never see. And as an artist, she taught me how to see as a child. As I grew up, there were books around the house, this Humboldt Oil travel journal that was illustrated by Buck Schweitz that showed Texas at a time when it was authentic, or the architecture was authentic to where it was. What of art in architecture? So, this is a 15th century Botticelli allegorical art, a palimpsest. Layers of cultural memory and meaning erased and rewritten time after time. Memories on top of realities, on top of memories. Renaissance on top of Florentine, on top of medieval, on top of Roman. It's what shaped the American identity as well. This idea of what Western culture was. Early American artists were using European landscapes and mythologies as a basis for their art. This is Thomas Cole's Course of an Empire. But in 1836, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a short book called Nature. It was the #1 best-selling book in American history, based on transcendentalism, that we were at one with nature, and that nature is as close to God as we come to in life. It instructs us in every moment. And that we can only have knowledge through those things we experience. Human understanding is based on an understanding shaped by the laws of nature. Suddenly, American artists, such as the Hudson River School, began to paint American landscapes, where human beings and nature coexist, where poetic and artistic inspiration found no impediments, abandoning rationalism for emotion and feeling, where landscapes rose like great cathedrals in the realms of light where the deity seemed to reside, a primordial image of American wholeness, the ideal relationship between humanity and all-powerful nature. Nature is God's refuge to the poet hero, and the idea that by observing, by seeing, one will know God and will know truth. America was vast and full of possibilities, and this view of ourselves shaped a nation of brotherhood, humanity, and ecology. They showed natural majesty during a time of American expansionism west. Artists searching for the balance of human expansion and the preservation of nature. They saw the manifestation of God in nature. Moran's painting of Yellowstone so touched the American spirit of who we are, it created our first national park. For Winslow Homer, it was not only about what he was seeing, but also the constant and obsessive search. Other American artists would follow this tradition into the 20th century. Here we have N.C. Wyatt. Now, this painting is interesting. And it's what I like to say, what John Ruskin called measuring the moods of nature. But this belonged to a client of mine, Linda Bean. And I was up in Maine one time, and I called up Linda, and I said, Linda, would you like to have a coffee? She said, sure, maybe at 8 a.m. at this pier in Port Clyde. And so I get there at 8 a.m., and I see this lobster boat just humming across the harbor. And it, just as it looks like it's going to hit the pier and I have to dive off, it does a perfect pivot and just kisses the dock. And there's Linda Bean at 84 years old behind the wheel. And so tells me to hop in, I hop in, and we go over to her little island where her house is. And so walk up through the blueberry bushes up to her front door, and in her front hall sits this painting. And she said, now, Michael, look out the front door to your left. And so I turn and look out, and there is black spruce ledge right in the view framed by her front door. So she was very close to this landscape. In fact, so close, this N.C. Wyatt painting, Island Funeral, was of the island that she lived on. And this painting hung over her fireplace, and it was a big painting. This is probably 6 by 10. Hangs over her fireplace, or hung over her fireplace. Regrettably, Linda passed probably about a year and a half ago. But then on the other side of the fireplace is this marvelous full-size charcoal sketch that N.C. Wyatt did of the painting. And so these regional modernists like N.C., it was the study of that intersection of the forces of where the sea met the land. And that relationship between that landscape and man that shaped our American culture. In Monhegan, Maine, there was an art colony where Rockwell Kent, Edward Hopper, all of the Wyatts, and George Bellows, whose father was an architect, painted. Edward Hopper was known for seeing the landscape not as a collection of objects, but of blocks of color. Most importantly, Edward Hopper's aesthetic strategies, synesthesia, or cross-century imagery. That ability of what Walter Wells said of artists to have us taste what we see, hear what we feel, to give odorful color, melodious flavor, or a chill wind perceived as a wailing siren or quivering blue light. Hopper was so good at this, he was known as the poet of solitude, able to paint the loneliness of a place. What if architects could understand their buildings on this level? English art critic John Ruskin said, "To draw is to gain an empirical knowledge, an understanding through experiencing. To draw the leaf is to know the forest." And so many architects at that time were attending art schools before becoming architects. Here we have Charles Platt, who was another artist in the New England art colony, the Cornish art colony in New Hampshire, where he lived and studied with Maxfield Parrish, among others. He had also studied at the Academy Julian in Paris. He would eventually change his placard from artist to architect. And at the turn of the century, Platt would become America's most celebrated architect. Maine architect John Calvin Stevens, this is his painting kit, would paint landscapes not for the sake of art, but almost as a ceremonial seeing of the site. It's interesting that John Calvin Stevens was the natural choice for Winslow Homer to design his studio. And John Calvin Stevens didn't ask for a fee of Homer. He was a pretty smart guy. He said, "All you need to do is give me a painting." And so it was said that Homer gave Stevens a painting of his studio in the fog. Instrumenting in the drawing culture of the Northeast, Stevens would often say to his colleagues, "Do you sketch?" There would be no shortage of opportunity to improve your skills. This was so important to Stevens that he gathered other architects to paint with him. They called themselves the Brushins, friends like William Ralph Emerson and Robert Swain Peabody of Peabody and Stearns. These architects were the first to formulate the first true American architecture in the shingle style, what Vincent Scully referred to as America's first indigenous architecture. An architecture at the intersection of man and nature, built of the materials of the land, wood, shingle, and stone. In Boston, this idea that architects should draw formed America's first architectural school, based upon art and science, MIT. Samuel Chamberlain would be the first professor of drawing. And American journals would begin to encourage drawing and documentation abroad within the architectural studios. Architects' contributing studies were drawing of how we observed as architects was the nucleus of practice. And learning the language of place was a basis for knowledge in architecture. MIT students like Cass Gilbert, the seeing and the understanding and the knowing. Julian Francis Abel was the first Black American to graduate architecture school at the University of Pennsylvania, who would later go on to design the tower at Duke University. Another University of Pennsylvania grad, John Kell, won the Henry Gillette Woodman Traveling Scholarship in 1931. John Kell would come to San Antonio to work on the Federal Building with Paul Craig. Now, this was my intersection with that drawing culture. For John Kell, at something like 84 years old, sat in the back of the studio of the firm I first went to work for in San Antonio. And he wouldn't talk about the days of drawing. The family didn't even know these drawings existed until after his death. But he did share a story of how he and Louis Kahn shared a desk at Paul Cray's office. And when there was a downturn and there wasn't enough work for the office, Paul Cray had to let somebody go and let go Louis Kahn. In California, Ralph Waldo Emerson's book would continue to have an impact. Joseph Worcester established the arts and crafts movement there, influenced by Jack London's Call of the Wild and his good friend John Muir's Musings of Nature. He would go on to board a young architect by the name of Bernard Maybach. This is one of Bernard's drawings. MIT graduate John Galen Howard would embrace this ideology and would take this idea of nature and drawing to the West Coast and become the head of the School of Architecture at Berkeley, where he would teach luminaries like Julia Morgan, the first woman to attend the École des Beaux-Arts. And Mary Coulter, who was a child, collected Indian drawings, hiding them from her mother when she burned anything Indian fearing smallpox. Mary would go on to define the architecture of the West with her railroad hotels at national parks and cities like Santa Fe. You would have architects like Bertram Goodhue, drawn from New York to Boston by the young artistic intellectuals of the Society of Arts and Crafts. He would then travel to Mexico, and in his book in his early 20s, Mexican Memories, A Slight Sojourn to South of the Yellow Rio Grande, document the buildings by drawing. Bertram would then replace Irving Gill as the chief architect of the Panama exhibition in 1915, where he reinforced this new concept of regionalism and a recognition of culture and landscape and American architecture. This idea of regional identity took hold with architects like George Washington Smith, who built what the 1925 Architectural Digest article called a style of architecture that has become peculiarly characteristic of California. Now, George Washington Smith didn't go to California to do architecture. He went to California as an artist. He had also attended the Académie Julian in Paris and had exhibited his work with George Bellows at the fair and decided to stay behind in California. Now, since my book was on this idea of architects and the influence on their work, there was nothing I wanted more than to have this painting in my book. And I had known the gallery that sold this painting, and I called them up and I said, I know you have this painting. I would love to put it in my book. Would you mind putting me in contact with the person that bought it? And they said, no. And so I didn't have it in my book. We recently opened an office in Santa Barbara, and I was interviewing a builder and walking through a house that he had recently renovated, George Washington Smith house that he had recently renovated. And we turned a corner, and there it was. And he said, sure, they wouldn't mind at all. It's too late, the book is published. George Washington Smith also had a wonderful architect under his tutelage, Luda Maria Riggs. This is actually a design that she had done for a house in San Antonio. They would become instrumental in the redesign of Santa Barbara after the earthquake. Another young architect who would become instrumental after Santa Barbara's earthquake in 1925 would be Lionel Priest. Here you have the Bothan building that he designed. But Priest didn't just invent this architecture. It was an architecture that was deeply influenced by his travels abroad. Not only to Europe, but his travels deep into Mexico. And here are his romantic expressions of the villages of Guanajuato and the landscapes surrounding. Influenced by the landscapes of modern regionalists like Georgia O'Keeffe and Marston Hartley, Lionel Priest would eventually go on to become the director of the Art Institute of Seattle. So, to take a photo is merely a transference of data, capture versus response. To draw it as an architect is to observe it into my memory and make it become a part of who I am as a person and as an architect. Sometimes it's a quick sketch, this one being at 2 a.m. after I've arrived in Venice, the Grand Canal, or a more studied sketch in the sketchbook. This is Villa Capra. Sometimes sketching the local culture this along the River Nile. And places like this bridge in Provence, this Roman bridge in Provence. It's a mnemonic exercise. You know, while I sit here sketching this bridge, I feel the heat on the back of my neck. I smell the lavender from the adjacent field, and I hear the crickets sending an electric current through the air. Just different sketchbook sketches during travels. It's the Bahamas. And how these sketches eventually find their way into our work. This is a dovecote in France and a library that we designed and built from that precedent. So, studying landscapes plays a large role in my practice. This is just a few miles north of the Rio Grande. I sat on the side of the road doing this painting in my sketchbook. Stopped twice by the Border Patrol, asking me what the hell I was doing. It's the Rio Grande River Gorge, north of Taos. A sketch of South Padre Island as a study before we designed a tower. And this sketch of the Hudson Valley, where we're to build a house this fall. This is a quick pencil study of a canyon that we were building a house back up against, and then the view looking out from where that house was going to be in West Texas. The design of the house, and then the execution of that house within the landscape. This was a project in the Panhandle where it looks as though there's absolutely nothing. But it informed this tower that anchored this house. And this tower was somewhat brilliant because the client could go up and watch what's called these blue northers as they sweep across the plain. But the brilliance of it was that he could run down the stairs to the storm shelter that doubled as his wine cellar. This is a quick sketchbook sketch of a view over Moosehead Lake in Maine, and the house that would occupy the site and have the view out towards that view, and the realization of that house within the landscape. This is a sketch of a ranch about an hour and a half drive west of San Antonio, and the landscape that this house would look out upon, and the view of that landscape after the house was built, and the ranch house as it sits within the landscape. And built of the land, from the land. These columns you see here were actually retrieved by the contractor floating down the river and bringing in the dead logs so that we could choose columns from a number of them. And then the library, built of antique cypress and oak. This is a view of Castle Creek in Aspen before we built the house, and that view from the house. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of going to a site visit in spring. This is trudging through 2 feet of snow, looking upon the view for a house in Telluride. And then, so these landscapes begin to form the design and the understanding of a place and how to respond to a place. This is Baltimore. And this is in Montecito. The diversity of the work we do isn't incidental. It's informed by these empirical understandings of the landscape and culture and place. Sometimes informed by strange things, such as this ancient cypress tree clinging to the bank of a river in the hill country of Texas, and how that begins to inform the house that clings to the bluff overlooking the river. Now, this was the house that, or the sketch, I should say, that helped me earn my stripes to be here today. 20 years ago, I was invited to a charrette, or I should say placed in a charrette. A friend of mine knew a charrette was going on and at the Raleigh Hotel in Miami, and got me invited. And that charrette, being my first charrette, was the charrette visioning Alice Beach. And so Andreas, not knowing who the hell I was, this young kid, I was too young for Seaside, I should say. Robert, Scott. They set me in the back of the room, and it was like going to graduate school in a week. I mean, working with Scott Merrill and Steve Mouzon and the DPZ team, Galena and Senin and all these people. It was just astonishing to me. And I sat in the back of the room, and after the third day, I did this sketch of what they envisioned Alice Beach to be one day. And so I earned my stripes and was brought back to begin to design some of the initial houses at Alice Beach. And this was the first house I did. I think it may have been the first house where the living room was inverted to be on the upper level instead of the main level. And then did several houses in the first phase of Alice Beach, and then eventually began to pick up private clients. This was our first house on the other side of 38, on the beach side of 38. You see the Fontville Press there in the background. But this idea, this trust that building on this blank slate, but knowing you're going to be a part of a larger canvas eventually. And so this house is now just within a series of townhouses. And then going on to build or to design larger houses towards the beach. This was a compound that we were asked to do. We were very ambitious and called it Villa Laurentine, but had fun really studying the courtyard and taking it to another level. That house didn't get built, unfortunately, but we did build this house on the beach green, which was an example of, it was more than a house. It was an expression of the town plan itself. This was a gateway to the green and to the sea. And so it had to read as such. And had different aspects of the house. This faced, of the town plan. This facade faced the beach club, so it was again somewhat different. And then developing the internal courtyard. This courtyard wasn't incidental. You heard Andreas talk lovingly about his transformers last night. This was informed by one of those transformers being inconveniently located in the corner of our site, and we had to build around it. So, but then we left Alice Beach for a while. I think the town started being developed. I think Jason Comer left. The town started being built out more by local architects. And eventually, we came back. It was probably a good 8 years later. And I had felt like the original language, the original DNA that was being expressed, that we had started in Alice Beach, had become over-motifed, had almost become a cartoon of itself. And so I just wanted to break that. So we designed this house across the street from the Khoury-Vogt. Unfortunately, a tragic story that a month before the client was to move in, a painter's rag caught on fire and destroyed the interior. And they spent a year with the insurance company trying to get things situated. And within that year, somebody else bought the house and ripped out the entire interior. This is all we have of that house now. And then eventually we were asked to build 2 buildings on the green. And so initially I was thrilled, excited beyond to have this opportunity, and then quickly realized that we were going to be sandwiched between Stefanos Palazoidis, who's the dean of the architecture school at Notre Dame, and my hero Scott Merrill, who I considered his building to be the penultimate expression of the evolution of the Alice Beach aesthetic, and thought, how in the hell am I going to do this? And so we went back to this DNA pool and looking at the Caribbean and trying to understand how we can create a new expression that hadn't been done before, but embodied all of that, which was Alice Beach. And so I ended up going to Havana and was impressed by the stature of the Plaza de Armas. And that was the precedent that we ended up choosing. But we didn't want to be literal with the building, and so we looked to Colin Roll's idea of new formalism, where you look to classicism and then just boil it down to its rudimentary elements, and we ended up with this expression. And then today, yesterday I was there going through the final punch list, and look forward to this building contributing to the community at Alice Beach soon. And so, back to this idea that nobody knew who I was when I joined that charrette at Alice Beach. I soon became a part of the DPC cadre and was invited to a number of charrettes. This one was in Spain. Again, arriving at something like 2 a.m. in the morning, not being able to sleep, and going out on the terrace and sketching Arcos de la Frontera just to kind of get the creative juices flowing. And eventually, we'd design a street within the new town, looking at the different housing typologies that we would develop. And trying to, I think my relationship with DPZ really worked well because of this experience of trying to understand landscape, culture, and place, and developing an understanding of what that DNA meant, to develop a language of architecture that spoke true to where you were. This is in Scotland, and this was at Schooner Bay in the Bahamas, and even Mecca, Saudi Arabia. And so when I as I said, when I did the Alice Beach charrette, it was the first charrette we had ever done. But it became an amazing tool for us as a firm, and we began to do charrettes on numerous projects. This was for a seminary in North Carolina, and so that seminary design developed further. This is schematic design as it began to develop, and then the built seminary lacking phase 2, which is the chapel that you see here. And then here's the chapel today as it's under construction. This is a sorority house. This is a quick sketch during a charrette of a sorority house at the University of Arkansas. The schematic design and the realized building, very close from that charrette drawing. And what we found was, from these charrette drawings, that we would start with a concept, but it wasn't our concept because we had spent so much time with the client. There was an understanding and there was a buy-in. And so it wasn't our concept, it was their concept as well. And so you really saw this idea from this very conceptual phase in the very beginning to the end of construction, being able to realize that vision from the beginning. This is the ISI, or the Linda Bean Center in Delaware. Sometimes a charrette merely pulls out an idea of a language, and it's not a specific building whatsoever. This was during a quick charrette with DPZ at Windsor. This was a building that came out of working with Andreas' brother Douglas in Costa Rica, and the realization of a house from that design. And so this understanding of landscape and culture and beginning to process this through drawings to end up at a design is central to who we are as a firm. This is a project in Montana. And it begins with that early seed, that very quick, what's in my head kind of sketch, developing further into an idea and continuing to pull the thread until you end up with a real design. This is for a project on the Colorado River in Colorado. And you see here, you're beginning to look at the forms as they stretch out along a precipice at the bend of the river. And then how that plan begins to respond to the landscape and to the views and to the weather, an inner courtyard for the protection from the strong winds. And then seeing that as it begins to come together as a design, to the point to where it may sound strange, but drawing every single stone by hand so that you understand mentally the weight and the shape and the form of that stone and how that's going to inform the design. This is a quick sketch of the landscape of the prairie west of Fort Worth, and beginning to think of a tower that kind of emerges off of the brow of the hill. The tower doesn't get any higher than the house, but because the hill drops off, it helps form this higher element. Here's the view of that landscape as framed by the house, and then the house within the prairie, and that tower as it's finally realized. A conceptual drawing for a house in Pasadena, California, and the realization of those drawings, down to the understanding of light and form. This was a fun one. This was a project in Mexico, in Baja, and there was this giant mound of boulders looking out over the Sea of Cortez, and this idea that like a child, you'd be able to explore the boulders within the plan of the house, or like the plan of the house, or like the boulders, you'd be able to explore the plan, then be able to go on top of and through and around and within. This is my my elevations of the house. And then the realization of that house overlooking the Sierra Cortez. More private entry. It becomes a series of experiences informed by that landscape. The entering, the around, the through, on top of, and within. And so we had our own version of the Brussians. We've got a much cooler name. We call ourselves the Whiskey Watercolor Club. And it's a couple of architects from New York, Tom Kligerman, Doug Wright, Enki Barnes from Washington, D.C., and Steve Ruga. And we were traveling together a lot for these boards that we sit on, and we decided to start taking our paints with us and started painting. This is India. The stepwells of India. And so wherever we went, we started painting. And it not only helped us see the places, but it also bound us as friends to be able to paint together as we were observing together. And so we had gone to India, and it was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we had to all fly home, and we thought, wow, this is fantastic. We need to keep painting. And so we decided to keep painting together on Zoom. And what we did was start taking the master's works, like John Singer's Sargent, and say, how in the world is he able to express the luminosity? How is he able to express light? And so this is my copy of a John Singer Sargent exploring that understanding. Or Francis McComas, understanding blocks of color. Or Augustus Osborne Lampo, an atmosphere. And so as things lightened up over the pandemic, we continued to travel. This is a short trip we took to Santa Fe. And quickly understood that it was different painting in the landscape than it was in our studios, where this is sitting out in the desert, the Sangria Desert, and you would mix your paint and the watercolor, make a stroke, and go back to your watercolor kit, and the water would already be evaporated. Versus in Ireland, where it's constantly drizzling when you're painting as you go. And so we would explore these things together as architects, and it was an amazing growth period for my understanding through drawing. One trip we decided to go, our last trip was to Italy to study the landscapes with, I think a lot of you know Stephen Harvey, and figure painting with Wendy Arden. My wife was like, oh, you need to be a better architect and have to go to the Amalfi Coast with your buddies and paint nudes. Yeah. But it was informative. These were these quick studies where Wendy would set up these 10-minute exercises. You don't draw, you just simply let the paintbrush follow the contours of light and shadow. And so, these are two drawings. One I did before that was a pencil drawing that I filled in with watercolor. And then one I did after where there was no drawing at all, just following light and shadow. And so these practices help me to convey my thoughts directly on paper without thinking, but a mere conveyance of thought through the hand. So I had an opportunity to build a studio in Maine, and this was my vision. I didn't get that. I got a room. But it allowed me for the first time. It just finished right at the end of the pandemic, and so I was able to really paint and focus for the first time. This is a view out of my window looking towards moss and birches, a quarry down the road, a lighthouse around the corner, the harbor, and drawing different seasons. Each drawing from nature trains your eye to understand our environment, where you learn from nature color theory, perspective, light, composition, translucency, reflectance, pattern, texture, form, complexity, and atmosphere. We have the sketch club in our office 10 minutes every Friday, where the kids in our office all get together and they begin to sketch. And so these are their sketches that come out of those practices. And obviously, these begin to find their way in our work. This is a writing camp in Ohio. Jim Linehan in our office, who now teaches a drawing class up at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. It's part-time. He goes back and forth. And so this begins to inform the entire studio and how we work. And what most importantly is this understanding of the landscape that begins to inform our buildings. And so this is a recent project in California, and my sketchbook sketch of the landscape, looking at the mountains on this 360-degree view from this site. And then how that begins to inform the site planning and the site, and the sequence of experiences as you move through that site. Alexander Ford also teaches drawing part-time on the side for the University of Texas, San Antonio. Most recently, we've been involved with master planning at Hillsdale College in Michigan, and some of the drawings that have come out of that. Some of these are, such as this one, is not a watercolor. It's actually a computer drawing that is done from the understanding of what watercolor has brought to us. It's these monumental steps that connect the lower campus to the upper quad. And then computer drawing showing the sequence of vaults, these series of vaults that are probably the largest sequence of Guastavino vaults built in the U.S. in the last 75 or 100 years. This is our mock-up going up on campus. Self-supporting, no-form work. All the bricks put in place, suspended in air. And then some of the sketches the office have done on some of the interior spaces. One of the connecting structures. Computer drawing of the elevation of the South Library. And then a hand drawing of that interior. And then, having fun with the computer, playing with, an effect like Joseph Gandy and getting this spooky 18th century effect. It says it's a computer drawing as well, informed by our watercolors. And then, I don't know if anybody can recognize this artist, but Lutyens had his master renderer, William Walcott. And so if y'all know William Walcott, you would recognize this rendering. But in fact, this is not a William Walcott. This is an AI rendering after William Walcott's work. And so, where do we go from here? So here's a drawing that, here I sit in the red dirt valley outside of Santa Fe, the sun on my back. I hear the high hawk calling, and I smell the cedar and sage, as I imagine a home that will forever marry with the spirit of the land. And that's why, as an architect, I draw. Thank you.